So yeah, if you're in section 3, you already know me. My name is Maya. I'm a third-year grad student in the program. Wait, is Panopto allowed to access files in your downloads folder?
It is.
Okay. I am a third-year grad student in the History of Medicine program. I work on the history of public hospital medicine in the U.S. South, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Paris medicine, which has a lot to do with hospital medicine, so I'm really excited to talk about this today. I hope by the end of lecture, you too will be really excited about Paris medicine. And so in just 50 minutes today, I'm going to try to convince you that the collection of practices, ideas, and technologies that emerged at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in revolutionary Paris transformed hospital spaces, going from sort of the kind of space that you see on the left to the kind of space that you see on the right that today we would recognize as a modern hospital, radically changed and standardized medical education, centering it around the hospital. Also radically changed medical epistemology, how physicians know what they know, and reformed definitions of disease and health, and finally revolutionized the physician-patient encounter, changing the patient into smaller and smaller units from a whole human being in the early modern period to organs to parts of organs. So that's a lot to cover today. Ultimately, I'm going to try to convince you that what historians call Paris medicine inaugurated a new era of modern medicine in which we are still living today. And at the end of this lecture, I hope that you'll be able to answer these questions. So how did the hospital change? How did physicians' practice of medicine change? How did physicians' understanding of disease change? And how did patient experience change, or did it, all at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century? And we're going to start sort of talking also about the question, how is it that historians know? And we're going to go into that in more detail in section as well. So in order to get to these big questions, I'm going to need to give you some context on the end of the 18th century in Europe and elsewhere. So I recognize that a lot of you are not history majors, so we're going to go over the broad outlines of what was happening in Europe at the end of the 18th century. We're going to discuss the long history of the hospitals, which will be like a review for those of you who took the first half of this class, but will be sort of good for all of us to know. We're also I'm going to introduce you to a fascinating cast of characters who were all young physicians at the turn of the century in Paris. And then finally, we're going to talk about what these changes in hospital medicine and in medical epistemology meant for the patients. And so I'm going to give you a sort of sneak peek of what we're doing in section this week in order to capture the patient's voice. Along the way, we're also going to have several things that I'm calling theory interludes. This is just sort of like a flag for you to know that I'm going to be pulling back from giving you new content, and we're going to be talking about frameworks into which you can sort of put this new information. So theory is something that historians use to put historical facts into conversation with one another and articulate how and why they're significant. And over the course of this lecture, we're going to try out several theories for understanding how medicine changed at the beginning of the 19th century and what this change meant for physicians and patients. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to jump straight into talking about the context for the medical changes that took place in Paris at the end of the 18th century. As some of you probably already know, the late 18th and early 19th centuries were quite a time for France and Europe in general. So you all have seen this slide before. This is just to remind you that we call this time period the Age of Revolutions. So the world was changing really, really rapidly at the end of the 18th century and changing in a global way. And so all around the world, monarchies were crumbling. The enlightened absolutism that we discussed in previous lectures was being questioned and being replaced with something more radically egalitarian. So today, since we're talking about Europe in particular, we're going to just focus on two of these revolutions in the Age of Revolutions. So European historians consider these two revolutions together the dual revolution. So on one hand, we have the Industrial Revolution and then the French Revolution of 1789. And the Industrial Revolution, which started around 1760 in Britain, but started at different times in different places around the globe, resulted in the establishment of large mechanized factories in urban centers, especially in Britain, but as I mentioned, throughout Europe. And so what did this mean? This meant that large swaths of the population were moving from the countryside into the city. Cities were becoming more crowded, more urban. Workhouses were being established where people would go to work long hours in dangerous factory environments. And these factory environments were also very mechanized. So you can see here, the classic case is textile factories, but this is a match factory. You can see all the mechanism. You can see everyone is sitting at a desk that looks exactly identical to their neighbor's desk. So essentially what this did is, first, it upped the possibility of industrial accidents. So sort of violent industrial accidents were a fact of life. And it also made human beings feel like they were sort of cogs in a machine. So the two things I want you to get out of the sort of Industrial Revolution context is this mass urbanization, which, as we have already seen, people like Joseph Frank or Johann Frank were interested in sort of considering from a public health perspective, like what did this do to disease in the city, what did this do to injury rates in the city, and it also resulted in dehumanization, so people sort of feeling like they were part of a faceless mass. At the same time, in France, we had, there was sort of the French monarchy had a debt problem. So I mentioned before, in the Age of Revolutions, you'll notice the American Revolution is on here. The French monarchy was funding the American Revolution. It also just fought the French and Indian War. The French monarchy had no money to solve this problem. It sort of started taxing commoners more heavily, and this is like French Revolution light, so ask me if you want more details. But essentially, commoners did not like this, and it resulted in an overthrow of the government, and resulted in a new Republican government that was committed to all citizens being treated the same, which was sort of codified in this document that was an ideal vision of what the French Republic would look like. That document is the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Every citizen had the right to vote, and who was a citizen is another question that I'm not going to have time to go into. It was also a deliberately anti-clerical and anti-aristocratic government. So essentially what happened in France is that a Catholic monarchy became a secular republic overnight, and life sort of radically reorganized. So why is it that we talk about these two revolutions together, and why am I telling you about them in a history of medicine class? So I'm telling you about them now because they provide the political and technological context for what today we recognize as modern medicine. So here are just a few things to throw out there to think about as we go through the rest of this lecture. I know this concept has come up before, but since we're going to be sort of stuck in the 19th century for a while, I want to mention that historians sometimes consider the French Revolution the start of the 19th century. So it's a long 19th century that goes from the French Revolution to the start of World War I, and we call it a century because there were sort of similar themes throughout that time period, even though it extended for more than 100 years. Also, as I've mentioned, we see industrial modernity, so new technology, new standardization, mechanization, and as we've already seen, these ideas sort of contributed to medicine. We'll see even more how this idea of mechanization and standardization is reflected in Paris medicine. We also see political aspects of this new modern world. So I mentioned the Catholic monarchy is becoming secular, the role of the church is being contested, and then we have this idea of rights discourse. It's sort of exemplified by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So there's an idea that the state owes certain services and protections to its citizens. I think we all saw this in Frank as well. And then on the other hand of this idea of individual rights, we also have the idea of the mass and mass politics. So masses of workers are becoming a working class. Masses of citizens always have the threat of sort of starting off mob rule, as we saw with all of these sort of popular revolutions. And the mass also raises questions about sanitation and public health, with people sort of all packed together in one spot, and health in the aggregate. And so, again, as we saw in Frank, also as we saw in some of the readings you wrote your essay about today, like Cartwright, we see medicine has a role in not only thinking about health, but also thinking about maintaining the state against the mass. So all of this is background for what we're going to talk about today. Now we're going to shift our gaze to see how these new ideas played out in the territory of the hospital. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to go back a little ways to talk about what the hospital was like before the revolution in France. So this is the Salpêtrière, which was a hospital for women that was founded in, I think, the medieval period, maybe early modern. Anyway, it was around for a while. This is a picture of what it might have looked like in the 1600s. And as those of you who took this class last semester probably remember, hospitals in the early modern world looked really different from hospitals that we think about today. And so I think we haven't really talked about the hospital yet. It's sort of been at the periphery of our conversation, and so now I want to bring it to the fore. In the early modern world, so prior to the French Revolution, hospitals were primarily religious institutions that were devoted to charity and respite rather than curative healing. People who were indigent, meaning homeless, didn't have anywhere else to go, were welcomed as well as the sick. Sometimes religious pilgrims would come and stay at hospitals. And so even for those who were sick, the hospital was really like a last resort. You did not want to go to the hospital. The hospital was where you went if you had no other options, if you couldn't be treated at home. And just sort of to put a pin on this, the word hospital itself shares a root with the modern word hotel and the word hospice. So you can imagine that this is sort of the array of functions that an early modern hospital might be expected to provide. And so who was doing the caregiving in these hospitals? Mostly religious orders, mostly nuns, especially in Catholic countries like France. And care itself involved rest, prayer, healthful diet, maybe some minor surgical procedures like lancing a boil. Some hospitals did employ physicians, but physicians were generally speaking sort of subordinate to the role of the church in regulating and administrating the hospital. And nuns also did all the day-to-day tasks of care. So essentially this idea of treatment as rest, balance, sort of regulation and ritual, this idea of treatment was going to radically shift, or the idea of disease implied by this kind of treatment was going to radically shift at the end of the 18th century. So we're going to talk about that. And I mentioned the church ran all the administrative aspects of the hospital, and it was also responsible for funding the hospital. So especially in a place like France, what would happen is the monarchy would pay the church, wealthy patrons would pay the church, and the church would take some of that money and devote it to charity. And some of that charity would be running hospitals. And so this was the model for Paris hospitals, of which there were several, including the Salpêtrière, which we just saw, the Hotel Dieu, and the Necker Hospital, which I don't have a good picture of. So just keep that in your mind as the pre-revolution model. Now, this was sort of the ideal. Unfortunately, even before the revolution, things were not peachy in the hospital. So as I mentioned, a lot of people were moving into the cities very rapidly, and hospitals just could not keep pace with this rapid urbanization. And so Paris hospitals just did not have the resources financially or spatially or in terms of care staff to deal with this influx of people. So just to give you an idea of how bad the situation was, 1 year before the revolution, a state official in France estimated that there were 35,000 patients in hospitals spread out around the city, and that amounted to about 5% of Paris's population. So imagine that, it's like a large amount of the population was living in the hospital. And even worse, only about 38% of these patients were actually medically ill. The rest were just kind of hanging out there because they didn't have another place to be, or they were too old or too infirm to work, or were like chronically ill and were sort of never going to be expected to recover. And additionally, sort of these poor conditions also led to sort of a degradation of moral values. So despite the church's best efforts, people often saw hospitals as sort of like dens of vice, where you could go, like lower elements of society would like go and mingle and participate in illegal activities like gambling. They could sort of carouse and drink and avoid work. So hospitals were not in great shape before the revolution. After the revolution, it got even worse. So as you remember, I said France went from being a Catholic monarchy to a secular republic. Along the way, one of the first things that the new republic did was to strip the church of all of its power and all of its property. And in so doing, the republic essentially took control of the hospitals, but didn't really have a plan for dealing with the hospital problem. And to make matters worse, the new republic forced anyone who was sort of associated with the church to sign a declaration saying they renounced the church and they were going to have an oath of loyalty to the republic instead. And a lot of the nuns who were working at these hospitals just up and left rather than signing that declaration. So essentially what happened is the church also, all the money from the church was sort of dried up because there was no monarchy anymore. And the republic found itself in charge of these hospitals that had no one to take care of the patients, so they'd lost the nuns, had no money, they'd lost the money, and additionally they'd gained this level of responsibility encapsulated by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So the idea that the state now actually had a moral responsibility to take care of indigent people and the sick. And this was a really new idea, so the old charity model of care that the church was putting forth was really invested in sort of taking care of the deserving poor or people who were morally worthy. And now the state had sort of made this claim that everyone, in terms of this individual social contract with the state, everyone was owed this basic right of health care. So, big problem. And in 1795, the revolutionary government put together a committee of physicians headed by Antoine Fourcroy to sort of fix this problem. So, what did Fourcroy suggest that France do? The first thing he suggested was that medical illness and social destitution were separate problems. So Fourcroy did not want this problem of people who just didn't have anywhere else to go hanging out in the hospitals. And he actually established a triage system run by physicians that was meant to admit only the most acutely medically ill patients to the hospital. And the idea was that people who were not sick shouldn't be in the hospital, they should be in hospices or in other institutions. And so the first thing he did was to separate them. Then he also sort of reaffirmed this idea that the state's responsibility is to provide health care for its citizens. He and the other physicians on this committee essentially took total control over the hospital. So the idea was previously medicine and surgery were sort of these separate professions, mostly confined to the university setting. Fourcroy suggested that they be parallel tracks and that they run the hospital. So instead of nuns and the church running the hospital, now we have physicians running the hospital. Big change. And then finally, Fourcroy was really interested in medical education. And I'm saying Fourcroy, but this was the French Republic overall. I'm sort of streamlining things for you. So the idea was, and this is a quote that's attributed to him, medical students should read little, see much, and do much. So if you remember, if you took the class last semester, medical education previously had been mostly confined to the lecture hall. So you could actually get a medical degree without ever setting foot in a hospital or seeing a patient. And that changed. So now medical education is going to be revolving around the hospital. And the hospital, this could only work because the hospital was essentially run by physicians who were also running the medical schools. So all of these reforms worked together to radically change the hospital and physician and patient experiences. So I want to talk just a little bit about the hospital and medical education. So you'll see that this is a letter from the late 19th century that's a petition for someone to serve as a resident physician at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. So essentially what these Paris hospital reforms did is they created a new standard so that less than 100 years later, this was kind of the standard for medical education. So we're still talking about things that were happening sort of cutting edge in Paris at the end of the 18th century, but then they had this ripple effect outward so that by the end of the 19th century, you really couldn't be a doctor without having spent some time in the hospital. And most hospitals in the Western world were sort of on this Paris medicine model that was run by physicians rather than the church. So additionally, I think someone said in one of their daily scribbles they were confused as to why Americans kept going to France to study medicine. This was why, because France had access to all of the patients and France had sort of unfettered access to the hospital in a way that other countries just didn't. So essentially, centers of medical learning shifted from the University of Padua, where it had been for years, sort of the Italian context, and now people were all traveling into France to learn medicine. So that persists throughout the 19th century. Now, something that we might want to ask ourselves, though, is this was a huge change on an administrative level and huge change for medical providers. Did it actually change the patient experience? And I think we can ask if it did, it might not have. So on one hand, after putting all these reforms in place, it became clear that no matter how you administered the hospital, you still need direct care staff. So all those nurses who were sort of fired in disgrace earlier actually got hired back without having to sign anything. And so essentially 20 years after, or like 10 years later after the revolution, the hospital was back to having like even the same people doing daily care. Additionally, the treatments didn't change that much, so physicians' approach to disease changed, but not the way that they suggested it be treated. So essentially, treatments were the same as they had always been, and daily life in the hospital, I might argue, didn't really change either. So previously, the hospital was sort of like patients would have their days sort of punctuated by daily prayer or sort of different scheduled elements of their day, and their days continued to be scheduled, and instead of being punctuated by prayer, they were punctuated by morning and evening rounds of the physician. And so ultimately, we can also ask, and this is sort of a question for section, did hospital social atmosphere change at all? Like, can we see evidence that patients remained sort of unruly, that there remained this idea or this sort of social atmosphere in the hospital that resisted regulation, even with all of these new impulses from the medical profession? So this is a big question mark to think about, but what did undeniably happen is that for the physicians who were training in this new hospital environment, the new hospitals did radically change their approach to disease and medicine. So now we're going to turn away from the patient and away from the hospital as an institution, and we're going to consider what these hospitals meant for physicians. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to go back in time again. So I'm sorry there's a lot of background in this lecture. And we're going to have to talk a little bit about the history of anatomical dissection. So more specifically, we have to talk about something called pathological anatomy. So simply put, pathological anatomy is the correlation between a state of disease and an anatomical finding. For instance, in this slide, in this slide you can see a lesion sort of on the upper lobe of this lung. And one might imagine that if you were to see a living patient who had lungs like this, they might have difficulty breathing. And so pathological anatomy is that connection between what the patient is experiencing and what you might see on autopsy like this. And this connection between the patient's probable lived experience and what the patient's corpse looked like after death is, as we'll see, one of the defining features of Paris medicine. In the late 18th century, this kind of anatomy, pathological anatomy, was actually quite a new field. So some of you might remember that human dissection had been a part of medical education since at least the 16th century, Vesalius, all that. But all of the dissections prior to this were sort of meant to show the human body in its ideal form. And so someone who was dissecting a cadaver and noticed a lung like this would actually probably ignore that in order of trying to extrapolate what the ideal form of the human body would look like. And so it was the idea of ignoring these deviations. Now, that started to change at the end of the 18th century. So I'm going to introduce you to the first of our physicians. This was a pathological anatomist in Padua by the name of Morgagni, who became really interested in what these sort of abnormalities in the body meant for disease. And so he actually put together an anatomical atlas that looked specifically at pathology, and he was the first person to do that. But crucially, he didn't really correlate pathology to symptoms, and the reason why he didn't is that the kinds of bodies that he was dissecting were not patients that he had taken care of. So sources of bodies in the early modern period were sort of a hotly contested issue. Supply and demand of corpses was a huge problem for medical education. And most corpses either came from sort of the illegal route of grave robbing or came from executed criminals who were sort of felt to be morally deserving of this kind of desecration. And so Morgagni had no chance to examine patients before their death. He just looked at the autopsies. So that idea of sort of the problem with the supply of corpses was one of the things that was radically changed by Paris medicine. So Parisian hospitals had a very different approach to death and dissection that then had been seen previously. I mentioned that part of the reason the French Republic took over the hospitals was this idea that there was an obligation of the state to care for the citizen, but the citizen also had an obligation to care for the state. And what that meant was that if you were to be a patient at the Necker Hospital or the Salpêtrière or the Hotel Dieu, and you died, the assumption was that your body was fair game for dissection. And so all of a sudden there was this vast quantity of pathological material that the medical profession had not had access to before. So now I'm going to introduce you to a young doctor named Bichat. Bichat was a surgeon in the military, and then he went to the Hotel Dieu in the early 19th century to study, and he loved dissecting. It was like his thing. So he dissected an insane number of corpses, mostly patients with tuberculosis, and you'll notice that he only lived to be about 30. That's because if you dissect a lot of people with tuberculosis, you also get tuberculosis. Still true today, like most pathologists test positive for tuberculosis, but that's a separate thing. So Bichat put two and two together and started thinking really carefully about the correlation between things that he saw in pathology and symptoms or diseases that patients might have. So here are a few of the really important interventions that Bichat made. So first, Bichat correlated pathology and symptoms, and then he put pathology first. So if a patient had the symptoms of, for instance, tuberculosis, but did not have any lung lesions on autopsy, Bichat would say that patient did not have tuberculosis. And Bichat was also interested in system-level pathology in tissues rather than organs. So we saw with Morgagni that he was really interested in looking at the organs. Bichat was more interested in thinking about where you could find a lesion anywhere in the body. So for instance, if a patient did not have the symptoms of tuberculosis, but on autopsy had a lesion in his liver that looked a lot like the tubercular lesions that Bichat was seeing in patients' lungs, then Bichat would say that patient had tuberculosis even though that patient had not had the symptoms. So essentially Bichat's work puts the patient's body above the patient's experience for the first time in medical history as a source of knowledge about disease. And Bichat reformulates disease as something that could happen in any organ, the same disease in any organ. It's not about a sort of like a derangement in the lungs and a derangement in the liver could actually be the same disease. It's not about sort of systemic issues of balance. It's about just finding the lesion and identifying what the lesion is. So if we go back to this slide from the beginning, we have sort of this progression of the patient as a whole human being to the patient as parts of organs, to the patient as sort of tissue pieces that are so indistinct that they could come from any organ. And I put an asterisk there because Bichat himself actually never used a microscope, but I think it's a good illustration of this pattern to sort of take this image where if you're not trained in histology, you have no idea what organ system this comes from. All you know is that there's this like big knot here that's a problem, right? So that's kind of Bichat's philosophy, is that it's like identifying just pieces of tissue that have the same problem, and it doesn't matter what part of the body they come from. So that brings us to our first theory interlude. So I know, at least I talked about this with my section. I think most sections have talked about this dichotomy between the physiological and the ontological view of disease. I also know that a lot of you sort of wrote on your scribbles that you had questions about what is illness or what is disease. So the answer is that what is illness is a very historically contingent question. It depends on sort of your social position. It also depends on where in history you are. So on one hand, we can sort of think of illness and think of ideas of illness on this spectrum from an idea that illness is something physiological, that's sort of a disruption in balance in organ systems or in body systems. It's an internal experience. It's something that you can be, like you can be sick. On the other end of the spectrum, you have this ontological idea of disease, where it's something that exists in the world in of itself and can sort of be externally observed. So you can sort of take it out of the patient and observe it. You can think of this as sort of having a lesion like this somewhere in your body. You can think of it as like having a disease rather than being sick. So what I'm just going to say today is that I'm going to try to convince you that Paris medicine sort of ideologically pushes ideas of disease for the medical profession more towards this ontological approach and more away from this physiological approach. So just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. So Bichat was doing all of this sort of theorizing in the morgue. What was happening then with these same ideas but in living patients? So in order to talk about that, we're going to talk about René Laennec. Laennec, along with another physician named Corvisart, revolutionized the practice of physical diagnosis. So that's like bedside examination of the patient to determine what kind of disease they have. And he revolutionized this using new technology and new techniques to quantify a patient's symptoms and correlate them with anatomy rather than the patient's history, even before the patient's death and autopsy. So you might have heard of Laennec before as the inventor of the stethoscope. Here he is with his stethoscope. You can sort of see it sitting next to the patient, doing an observation of the patient. And there are some apocryphal stories about how the stethoscope came to be, which I can tell you later if you're interested. But in sort of the big picture is Laennec realized that you could sort of use a long tube to put it up next to the patient to sort of standardize the kind of auscultation or listening that you could do of the patient's breath sounds or their heart sounds. And Laennec got a lot of mileage out of this invention. He did extensive research, meaning he would take care of patients, sort of monitor their daily progress, listen to them morning and evening, and then when they eventually died, because most of them did, he would go down to the morgue and cut up their bodies and see what he saw. So essentially, Laennec's work correlated patients' osculatory findings, so the way they were breathing during life, not with a healthy living patient, but rather with the corpse. So we can see here, this is just an image from it's an image from a different Laennec text than the one that you guys have to read for section, but this is the new technology of the stethoscope, and the implication is that this new technology enables the physician to look at the living patient and see this. So look at the living patient and see the patient as if they were laid out on the dissecting table. So crucially, the stethoscope introduced physical distance to the patient-physician encounter. It standardized a form of examination that previously had been considered an art rather than a science. It invited physicians to think of the patient in reference to the corpse rather than the healthy living body. And it encouraged physicians to think again in terms of tissues rather than symptoms or systems. So now I'm going to go to another theory interlude, and this is Michel Foucault. I don't know if you all have heard of him before, but he's kind of like a big name in history of medicine, science, technology. He's a French theorist from the 80s who's thought a lot about a lot of these questions. And Foucault calls this process of the whole sort of theoretical way disease was reframed during Paris medicine, the anatomo-clinical gaze. So essentially we can ask, what is this gaze? Who is being gazed at? And who is the gazer? And sort of why? So this is all the things that we've talked about already. So for Foucault, the anatomo-clinical gaze is shorthand for how physicians at the turn of the century in Paris, and Foucault might argue even up to the present day, look at patients and see, rather than the patient's story or lived experience, a collection of parts that's laid out as they would be on the dissecting table rather than in the living body. It's a move away from physiologic disease categories and towards ontologic disease categories. And it's a gaze that is mediated by technology like the stethoscope and recorded in scientific, reproducible terms. So if you all think this is a little bit harsh on Paris physicians, and if you think maybe there's actually some humanity even today in Western biomedicine, I'm actually with you. I'm just presenting to you sort of the most extreme version of this argument, and I would love in section for you guys to think about, and when you're reading the Laennec piece that you have, to think about the ways in which it might actually resist this argument about dehumanization. But so for today, I want to talk a little bit about the terms that Foucault and others say that patients get reduced to under this system. So we saw this slide before. This is a medical record, again, from the early 20th century at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. And here you can see the patient's symptoms are being reduced to these sort of numerical categories: pulse, respiration, intake, output, white blood cell count, and then up here a fever chart of sort of their temperature over time. So essentially, this is sort of an extension of this anatomo-clinical gaze, not only the physical observation being correlated to pathology, but also the idea that patients and patient experience is sort of reduced to numbers. And in fact, even individual patients also could be reduced to numbers. So the last physician I'm going to talk about today is a guy named Pierre Louis, who was also working in France at the same time. And Pierre Louis devised a method that he called the numerical method, which was essentially early health statistics. So Pierre Louis sort of correlated demographic information with disease case histories that were happening at the Hospital de Salpêtrière, which is where he was working, and sort of essentially reduced individual patients to numbers. And so I just want to spend a little time on this satirical image that came from a 19th century newspaper. And essentially what we see here is Pierre Louis is writing down the case number and sort of turning away from this patient. The patient looks really sick. The patient might even be dying, and he's not really paying attention, right? He's just writing the patient's sort of like making a mark on the board for what the case represents in terms of the numbers. So even at the time, this form of medicine was being sort of contested for what it did to the patient's humanity. Now, I think we can actually ask, though, is this cartoon an accurate representation of what patient experience was like under this new approach to medicine? Or is it actually, was patient experience actually different? And so how might we also know what patient's experience was like? So we've talked about the first three things on our list. Now we're going to talk a little bit about patients. And in order to do this, I'm going to take you outside of Paris to Charity Hospital, which is the subject of my dissertation, so this is a little bit selfish of me. But this is also a reminder that Paris medicine, even though it's known as Paris medicine, happened sort of globally. It was a sort of trend in medicine that rippled out from Paris globally. And Charity Hospital in particular has a lot of connections to France. So it was established by an order of nuns in the early 1700s. And it was established when Louisiana was still a French colony. And then, as we mentioned, France had all of these debt problems. In 1804, it sold Louisiana in order to pay off debts, in part. So then Charity Hospital essentially became an American hospital. And eventually sort of went through the same process of secularization, was owned by the state of Louisiana. And this is what it looked like in the 1850s. And I know you guys have some records from the 1850s, so this is the kind of place you should imagine. It looks a lot like those slides I showed you of the other Paris hospitals. And it was run essentially on the same sort of secular physician-run framework as other Paris hospitals. And then Charity Hospital, this is just to say Charity has a very long history up through the 20th century, and that's something else I'm happy to talk about later if you're interested. So now the question is, let's say that we want to sort of capture something about patient experience at a hospital like Charity in the mid-19th century. Like, what kinds of source materials might we use in order to learn something about patient experience? And I'll actually open it up to you guys, like, if anyone has an idea of sources, sort of primary source materials that could tell us about patient experience. Yeah?
Journals, because I know a lot of patients write those.
Great, so like journals written by patients? Mm-hmm. Great, so letters, other things that might be either from family or from patients to family. Any other thoughts? Oh, yeah, in the back, Henry. Great, so even in physician accounts, we might be able to sort of extract something about the patient's experience. That's a great observation. So, what sources do we have? I think you all mentioned diaries and letters, which are great, but a lot of patients were also illiterate. So what do we do about their experience? I think, I didn't put this up there, but the observation about physician case histories is a great one. And actually in my dissertation, I'm using a lot of case histories written by physicians. So that's a great observation. We can also think about hospital spaces as being a record of patient experience. We can think about how patients might have moved through the architecture of the hospital. We can look at material objects, legal records, newspaper records, and then also institutional records. But of course, institutional records also give us some problems because, especially by the mid-19th century, most hospitals were only writing down the kinds of things that were important to the hospital. So hospitals kind of came from the same sort of Pierre Louis school of big statistics, patients reduced to numbers. So what can we get from these kinds of records that might reduce patients to just a few numbers or just like one line in the admission book. So I think that institutional records actually can still be really useful, and I think a lot of historians have given us good models for ways in which these kinds of records can be useful. So I'm giving you my last theory interlude, which is a method that's devised by Marissa Fuentes, who's a historian of slavery, who actually is looking at plantation ledgers and the kind of documents that record human lives being bought and sold. And she says that even those kinds of documents can tell us something about the experience of the enslaved. And in order to learn those kinds of things, though, you have to sort of read them at a slant. And she calls this reading along the bias grain. So I think it's kind of not very clear just from that term what it means. It actually comes from like cutting fabric. I can talk to you about it more if you're interested. But I think the best way to illustrate this is with some examples. And this is also what we're going to do in section. So I don't want to give too much away. But essentially, what can institutional records tell us? These are all things that are taken from the same source that you guys are reading in section, from the 1851 Charity Hospital admission books. So first off, we can see some silences. So right here, this is a patient. The only thing we know about the patient is that his name is Henry. We don't know his age. We don't know where he was from. We don't know his marital status. All we know is his name and that he was enslaved to someone named Madame McCavitt. And so I think just thinking through why and how some information is relevant to the medical profession and some information isn't is already sort of an important hint at the kinds of experience that people might have had in these hospitals. We can also see experiences of violence. We can see experiences of loss sort of written in the margins of these medical records. And medical records or institutional records can also tell us sort of more tender things like where people circulated. So there are these two people who came from a workhouse. This person was picked up on the levee. And then we can also speculate about important possessions. So what was in this carpet bag that was left behind? What was in the bundle that was left behind? Why might some patients have come to the hospital with possessions and other patients might not have? Then finally, institutional records can also tell us things about sort of daily life in New Orleans more generally. So just looking at the different disease categories, which disease categories had some more slippage, which ones seem to be sort of standard over time, and what kinds of diseases were physicians recording at different times of year and for different kinds of patients. So that was a lot. Sort of to wrap up, we've talked about the context, we've talked about the history of hospitals, we've talked about a lot of these physicians, and we've talked about patients. So in summary, what is Paris medicine? It's a system of ideas, practices, and technologies that emerged at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Paris, which is why we call it Paris medicine, in the context of industrial and political revolutions, mass politics, and the changing relationship between the individual and the state. Paris medicine transformed hospitals from religious institutions that were sort of places of respite to specialized spaces for the care of the ill under the administration of medical professionals and physicians, made hospitals important, crucially important to medical education. And finally, Paris medicine was a radical transformation in physicians' ideas about disease and sort of reoriented medicine to focus on pathological anatomy rather than patient symptoms or experience, in a shift that Foucault calls the anatomo-clinical gaze, the shift from clinical experience to the anatomo-clinical gaze. And Foucault argues that this dehumanized patients. I think that we can question that. So I think some of these slides that I just showed you about things you can learn from medical records question that. I think also we can question if physicians themselves really were not as humanistic as they had been before. Is there some way that we can reconcile this humanistic view of medicine and pathological anatomy? And I think these are really relevant questions, especially even tracking them up through the present day. So that is our Paris medicine lecture, and there's like 5 minutes for questions, but I know you also have to turn in your papers. So.
And I'll say a couple of things too, but first, questions?
You can also email me or come to my office hours or ask me.
I was hoping that you all would join me in thanking my teacher for this really, really wonderful lecture. As you can tell, she is quite the expert in this material, and I'm so glad that she can speak to you about it today. I wanted to mention that somebody wrote on their scribble that they had just added the class. Please, please make an appointment to come talk to me if you've just added the class, or if you feel like you need to some assistance in catching up in any way whatsoever. But if you've just added, then certainly you have a lot of material to catch up on. You can do so. We'll help you do that. Let's see, what else? We'd ask you to turn in your essays here in your section folders, along with your daily scribbles. Although, if you didn't bring a scribble today, your essay will count as your attendance for the day. Just write on your essay, like, please count me for attendance as well to let us know that you haven't also turned in your scribble. So that's how we do attendance. And what else? If you can write your section number on your essay, just in case it wanders. We hope that it doesn't, but just in case someone else grades it, if you can write your section number, that would be great. Any questions? On Wednesday, I'm so excited. We have so much surgery to cover. 19th century was a time of huge change in surgical procedures and practices, and so I'm excited about talking about that. So, there we go. There's the section folders. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right.
How do we turn off Panopto?